Hello, everyone. Welcome back to my IGTV series, Is It Ableist? Episode number 8. My name is Devin, and I am so happy to be back with you all today. So, we are going to be talking about accessibility for educators. Yes, educators, accessibility includes you, and today I really wanted to kind of flip the script and talk about what accessibility looks for educators and faculty and in whatever capacity that you may be educating. As always, this is just my opinion based off of my experiences, but as I do every single week, I always encourage you to go beyond just my videos, out into the world, hear other people's experiences as well. So, without further ado, let's jump into this video. So the first thing that I want to talk about is employers. When you are hiring people for your business, there is always the possibility that you are hiring someone with a disability. As I've talked about before, disability is a spectrum. There are disabilities that you can plainly see very easily. There are also invisible disabilities that you cannot be seen, chronic illnesses, etc. So as an employer, always remember that there is a possibility that you have an employee with a disability, whether you know it or not, whether you can see it or not. That's why the ultimate goal of accessibility is to be able to have workspaces that are accessible no matter what, regardless to whether you know everything about having a disabled employee or if you don't know anything, the space is always accessible. When you are being hired for a job, my educators, it's so important that if you do have a disability and you are okay with sharing that disability in your workspace, it is crucial that you understand what your rights are. There's always a possibility of discrimination, ableism, even just danger in so many ways coming up in the workplace. And if you know what your legal rights are as a human with a disability, it's going to be really helpful for you. So I would highly suggest looking up the Americans with Disabilities Act, also known as the ADA Act, looking up that, looking at the website, just looking to see what your rights are, because it's incredibly important to know that going into any new job or whatever the situation may be. It's always important for you to understand and to know what your rights are. The next thing that I want to talk about is disclosing your disability. I'm going to be very open and very honest about the consequences that come along with this. As an educator, there's always a possibility that there are going to be consequences when you display your disability. Why? Because the truth of the matter is that the system is not set up for individuals with disabilities to be able to function within it as a able-bodied person would. So disclosing your disability can be the reason why you are not hired in the first place. And this is something that happens more often than not. To give a very specific example, about 80 to 85% of the blind and visually impaired community, which of course is my specific community within the disabled community, are not employed currently to this day. And most of that is due to not being able to be hired because of discrimination involving their disability. So it's something that you have to know, that disclosing your disability very well could be the reason that you are not hired in the first place. It's not fair. It is incredibly ableist, and it is a huge issue. But it is also the current reality of our system. The next thing is that by by not disclosing your disability, there's always the possibility of liability becoming an issue. And what I mean by this is that your employer may have an issue with you not disclosing your disability because it poses some type of liability to wherever you are working. In my personal opinion, liability is something that needs to be reconstructed because it is incredibly ableist in nature and really protects, in my opinion, from accountability in a lot of ways. But with that being said, you have to understand that if you are hired for a position and you do not tell your superior, whoever it may be, about your disability, and this comes back in a negative light towards you, that it is probably because it has something to do with liability. The third thing I want to talk about, and this is very specific to dance, but could also apply to other professions as well, is the clientele, your parents, your students. This also can be something that can prevent you from being hired in the first place as well. And that is the potential backlash from parents of having a staff member with a disability, and the possibility of the complaint of you being dangerous or not qualified enough to teach their children, as well as potentially sharing things about your disability that parents may not want to be shared. This is something that I ran into a lot when I was going through a period in my life where I was trying to be hired at a studio because I wanted to teach. And this was something that came up repeatedly about the potential issue of parents not being okay with the fact that their children are being taught by someone who is disabled. Again, this is something that is not fair, and that is unbelievably ableist and discriminatory, but nonetheless, it is the reality of where our world is currently. So this is something that if you are an educator who is wanting to go in to maybe a studio or whatever it may be, this is one that you need to be aware of as well. And it may be something that shows up a little bit later in the process where you may actually have parents that are coming to you and expressing that they are not comfortable with your disability. I wish that I had tips and things to really make this easier. This is one that I really don't have tips for, other than just being able to openly communicate with whoever your boss is, trying to openly communicate and educate your parents as well as the students. Sometimes your students are your best advocate to your parents. If your students understand, a lot of times that can make a big difference in your parents' understanding. So I think the wider your range of communication is and your education is, the better off you will be in terms of this issue. Something else that is incredibly important is establishing a line of creation. Oh my God. Another thing that is important is establishing a line of communication with your boss. Really opening that conversation up, asking questions about liability, about accessibility, about accommodation. Creating this line of communication is going to be helpful for you in the long run. Whether you have a disability or whether you don't, having this line of communication and being open and transparent will be important and detrimental to your future of being able to openly express about your disability or about an issue or about anything that comes up. Communication is extremely important, especially if you are someone with a disability and if you feel comfortable disclosing your disability. Communication is going to be your best friend. Another point on this is to ask questions sooner rather than later. And what I mean by this is that if you have been hired for a job, start asking questions then. If you're in an interviewing process and they ask you, do you have any questions? Come prepared with questions. That is going to be a really good starting point in terms of communication, and also questions usually yield answers or more questions. A lot of times if you come in with questions about accessibility or accommodation or liability, you can tell very quickly whether or not this is going to be a good fit for you based off of the answers or more questions that come in from this communication. So always err on the side of asking sooner rather than later. Another thing that I want to talk about is letting your students help you. And this is something that I touched on before, but I want to touch on it in this aspect as well. And like I was kind of saying earlier, your students can be your best asset when trying to communicate with parents and just letting them know that your disability is not a hindrance to your ability to educate. One of the best things you can do is be open and transparent with your students about your disability if you feel comfortable. This is going to potentially bring them in as well, because you never know. You could have a student who has maybe the same disability that you do, a similar disability, or just needs to hear more about disability to start normalizing it. The more that you can normalize having different body types, different ability types, having disabled bodies in your space, that's going to start to normalize disability and accessibility. And it's going to help your students understand that if they have a disability, that they have the right to be there and to be in that space and can exist with your other able-bodied students and also exist with you. So please be transparent with your students if you feel comfortable. And even if you don't, maybe take the time to express to your students that having different bodies in this space is completely okay, that we're all not different, we're all humans existing how we exist. Just reiterating those things in your classroom, even if you don't feel comfortable talking about your own disability. Normalizing these things is one of the major keys to be able to open up your space and to open up spaces in general for people with disabilities. Something else that is incredibly important when you are something else that is incredibly oh my god, I can't say this word. Something else that is incredibly important when you are an educator and you are in a new space, and a question that really should be at the forefront of your mind, is about safety. emergency protocols. This is something that is more important than I think most people really realize. And I'm speaking about this from personal experience. I had the chance to work with some emergency preparedness during my internship, and I realized very quickly that there is a really large gap of accessibility not being included in emergency preparedness and safety protocols. And this is incredibly dangerous for someone with a disability. If there are not protocols set in place for people who maybe have a wheelchair or maybe walk with canes or whatever the case may be, there needs to be safety protocols to make sure that individuals with disabilities are safe. If you're in a burning building, how are you going to make sure that everyone gets out safe? Everyone gets out safe. This is something that is crucial and is a question that you should be asking your employer. For your safety, for your students' safety, for the safety of everyone that is involved. Everybody needs to be included in emergency preparedness and safety protocols. And if there is nothing in place, that's where conversations need to start. That's where contacting people who are in the field of emergency preparedness, first responders, whoever it may be, who do have experience with helping people with varying needs, can come in and start to lay the foundation for that. Because leaving people that have disabilities, because leaving disabled people out of accessibility means that you are not taking care of everyone. And that is something that has to change. The next thing that I want to talk about is conventions and competitions. So if you watched my previous video about accessibility in conventions and competitions, I mentioned in that video that I personally feel like conventions and competitions are some of the most ableist things that exist within the dance community today. And I still stand by that because almost all conventions do not have any type of specific accessibility or accommodations to be able to support different needs for different people. And that is the reality that we are living in currently. And that does not change for faculty, for crew members that are working for these conventions and these competitions. And this is something that unbelievably needs to change. First things first, to my dance faculty members, something that I want you to know and I want you to understand and that I want you to take into your experience. Your needs matter. You are not a robot that is going to these conventions, teaching your 10 classes, collecting a paycheck, and going back home. No, you're a human being. Your needs are important. They are just as important as everyone who is coming in and out of these convention competition workspaces. So that is something that you need to know, first of all. Second, everything that I just said in this video applies to conventions and competitions. Absolutely everything. Knowing your rights. Who is your line of communication? And also communicating what is going to make the space safe for you as well. Because your safety in a space is just as important as your student's safety in a space. And ultimately, if your space isn't safe, your student's space isn't going to be safe either. So understand that your needs matter. Now, with that being said, how do you communicate your needs? This is when establishing a line of communication is going to be crucial for you as a faculty member or as a crew member, especially if you have a disability. This is where asking questions is going to be extremely important. If you are asking questions later rather than sooner, although I would advise the latter, but if you are asking questions later, this is when you need to talk to whoever your boss is about how can faculty communicate their needs? How can we communicate accommodations if we need them? How do we have this conversation? How can I tell you if something is not working for me? How can I express to you if I see an issue happening and it's something that really needs to be reported? Asking these questions is extremely important because a lot of the time, these things aren't taken care of because they're not spoken about, and there are no questions being asked around this, and so therefore it's something that just doesn't get addressed in the first place. Employers, I want to say this again. There is a strong possibility that you will have a faculty member with a disability, whether they tell you or not. It is incredibly important that you establish a line of communication with your employees as well. How are you going to let them know that they can come to you and they can talk to you and they can let you know if something is needed for them? How are you going to make the space accessible for the people that you are expecting to educate for you? And if you establish a line of communication with your educators, most likely that line of communication is going to continue down into the ones that are being educated. It's all connected. It's all connected. So I would urge employers to think about this from the very beginning, not to think about it later. Because there is a possibility you have a disabled employee. Always. Aim for making your business accessible from the get-go, not as an afterthought. That's what needs to change in the world in terms of accessibility, is accessibility being an afterthought. Faculty members, ask the questions, send the emails, send the text, do whatever needs to happen so that you can start to create safety within your own workspace. Because this is important, because you deserve to have accessibility there if you need it. You deserve to have that. So, what are some accommodations that you could potentially communicate? So, what are some So, I want to give some examples of some accommodations that you may want to ask for as a faculty member or that may be important to you. Mind you, these are just examples. These are not things that I think that you should ask for. These are just things that I would personally want to ask for if I was a faculty member on a convention, and maybe applicable to other people. But of course, accommodations, what people need in terms of accessibility, that's completely individual and is going to depend on that individual. But some examples are breaks. A lot of times when you're in the convention setting, if you've never been in it before, a lot of classes are stacked very closely together and does not leave a lot of break time for the students or for the faculty, and this can be very exhausting. And there are some disabilities that rely on having breaks and having rest to not be overexerted or injured or whatever it may be. Food, water, etc. Do you have access to snacks if you need to eat? Do you have access to water if you get dehydrated easily? Or just in general, we need food, we need water. Is that open and accessible to you? There are all kinds of disabilities that are nutrition dependent in terms of needing to have certain things, eat certain things, drink something, whatever. There are a lot of disabilities that depend on that. And this is a really important accommodation. Sound levels. I recently was communicating with a convention about making it possible to have noise canceling headphones for those who are sensitive to sound. Or I recently spent some time with a faculty member who mentioned having a really hard time being able to hear themselves speak on stage. So maybe that's something where there needs to be a possibility of educators having inner ears to be able to hear themselves on stage and communicate with their students. There are so many different accommodations, from sound to food to even lighting to your assistants. How can your assistants be a part of accessibility as well? There are so many different accommodations that can be brought up and discussed and talked about. So that's just some examples that I wanted to give, but like I said before, this is totally individualized. It depends on the person, it depends on the disability, and it also depends on whether or not they want to disclose their disability. And the last thing that I want to say in regards to competitions and conventions is, once again, emergency preparedness and safety protocols. And this is something that, with my experience in this particular realm of dance, I feel like is lacking in general. I don't hear a lot in terms of what safety protocols are in place just in general for most conventions and competitions, and how that intersects with where these competitions and conventions are taking place. What are the safety protocols within the hotel? What are the safety protocols within the buildings that you're going into? Things like that. And finding out whether or not they have accessibility built into their emergency plans. So faculty, this is something that you definitely should ask about, because there's always the potential for things to happen, especially when you have a lot of equipment and things like that. You're dealing with a lot of lights. There's always a possibility of something happening, and there's always the possibility that you could have someone with a disability who ends up being hurt or something like that because of it. So this is something that I feel like in general just needs to be better overall. But I think that's also something that is going to start to change with conversations and asking questions. Choreographic process. Choreographers, you are included in accessibility. Yes, you are. It includes you, and like I said before, you have needs when it comes to your choreographic process. The first thing that I want to say about this is that your dancers can be your biggest help in terms of communicating to them about your disability if you feel comfortable. And in a lot of ways, they almost end up being your assistants in terms of your creative process. To give an example of that, for me, I am very transparent about my dancers when I choreograph. To give an example, I am very transparent with my dancers when I choreograph. I let them know about my disability, and I express to them that there may be times and periods throughout the choreographic process where I may need their help in terms of formations, in terms of looking at spacing, in terms of transitions, different things that are inherently visual that as a choreographer I may miss or may not be aware that something is not working. Oftentimes my dancers will verbalize that to me and let me know, hey, this transition isn't quite working, or we're not really sure what's happening here. And that's always really helpful for me, because looking at things with my vision, I may not always see that something is not working. And my dancers are always the biggest help with that. So if you feel comfortable communicating and being transparent with your dancers, please do, because most of the time, if they're part of your choreographic process, it's because they want to be there and they want to share in that experience with you and to help you if you need it. And there's nothing wrong as a choreographer, especially if you're a choreographer with a disability, with asking for help. It's the hierarchy that we have all been brought up with that makes us feel like when we're in these certain positions that we have to be in control, that we have to know everything, that we have to come into these spaces having all the answers. And that's not true at all. And as someone with a disability who doesn't have the answers for reasons that are out of my control, I have to ask for help. And as I've grown as a choreographer, I have become more settled in that. So ask for help, communicate with your dancers if you feel comfortable, and trust me, it's going to really help your choreographic process. The next thing is, and this is something that is crucial, the next thing is, and this is something that has been crucial in my career, is having someone else come into your process and take a look at things. And this is not something that is necessarily disability specific. This is something that really is beneficial to anyone. But as someone who has a visual disability, having someone come in and really kind of be a second set of eyes for me has been incredibly important. You're talking about having a different perspective altogether, literally having someone look at it through their own filter, and what they see when they're watching your work may be totally different than what you're seeing. And this can be a really good indication of if what you are envisioning to happen or what you're wanting to be portrayed or not be portrayed, this can tell you whether or not that's translating. And of course that's going to be different for every person, but if you're bringing in someone that you really trust or that maybe you've worked with before that can come in and really be that second set of eyes for you, this can be really, really helpful if you have a visual disability or any type of disability, where just having someone and having some type of support system can be really helpful. And that's another form of asking for help, which you should not be ashamed of at all. It's always a really great thing to bring in another person and someone that you trust. It has been really helpful and, like I said earlier, crucial in my career to have someone else come in and look at my work and just be that second set of eyes, because they also can tell you if something's not working as well that maybe you didn't see and you don't realize, and sometimes your dancers don't realize either. So bring in that third party if you feel comfortable. Next thing is accessibility and choreographic process as it pertains to more commercialized work as well as film and that realm of dance. I'm going to be completely honest when I say this is another aspect of the dance community that is inherently ableist and is one of the most ableist within the dance community right now. With that being said, there are ways to be able to make these spaces more accessible for you as a choreographer, but it's going to be crucial for you to have a support system. This support system can look very different depending on what you're choreographing, what the job is, what's happening in this space. But I cannot tell you how important it is to have a support system with you in these types of situations. If you have a visual disability, this is going to especially be important, depending on what your visual disability is. To give an example of this, dance film is very difficult for me as a choreographer because film is inherently visual. You're looking at different shots, different angles, different colors, all of these things. And it's very, very difficult for me to do. Have I done it before by myself? I have, but it's a very difficult process. And when you're going into these types of processes that are inherently ableist, being transparent is really the only way that you're going to be able to make sure that what you want comes to life. Another example of that from my own personal experience is, for instance, communicating with lighting designers. If I'm working with a lighting designer, I always have to communicate with them that I am fully colorblind, because color is a big part in terms of film as well as on stage. So this is something that I have to communicate in order to be able to make sure that that part of my choreographic process and my final product turns out to be somewhat even close to what I'm looking for. This is why having a support system is going to be very important, because here's the truth of the matter. When you're communicating with whoever about what your overall vision is, there's always the possibility that you can be taken advantage of. And this is very unfortunate, and it's not fair, and it's incredibly ableist, but it is the truth. You can be taken advantage of very easily, and this is something that can happen regardless of if you're able-bodied or disabled. But as a disabled person, having a support system that can be there for you in some kind of way is going to be your best bet in being able to navigate this. What's even better than just having that open line of communication is if you can work with people who know you or have worked with you before. This is the ultimate in terms of this situation, because if you're working with people who know you and who have worked with you before and kind of know your work in some way, this is going to be very helpful, because they really are your support system in that moment, because they can really help communicate what your vision is. But that's not always the case. So come in as clear and as specific as you can be. Have some type of support system, whether it's someone pre-designing your lights for you, whether you can, if you can have someone come in with you and actually be there with you, that's even better, because now you have a level of accountability of someone actually being there to be able to be that buffer and hopefully just completely erasing the possibility of you being taken advantage of. But if that support system is not there, because let's face it, it's not always there, the more specific you can be about what you're wanting, and the more transparent that you can be about your disability and how that is going to be a factor within what your end product is going to be, that is your best bet. But just know that the possibility of being taken advantage of by people who don't know you and also who do know you is possible. It's always possible. It's unfortunate and it's unfair, but it is the truth. And I am not here to lie to you. I am here to tell you the truth. That is a possibility with people who know you and people who don't. Because the downside of it is if someone wants to take advantage of you and they know you and they know certain things about your process and what you want, that also can make it easier. So those are just things to think about when you're going into this realm. Something else to think about is that accessibility is also going to change depending on where you are. So if you're on set at a big production studio, all of these, like something like that. So if you're on set at a big sound stage, whatever the case may be, your accessibility is going to be different versus if you're filming a concept video in a warehouse that you rented out and you've hired people to come in. Accessibility is going to change depending on where you are. It's also going to change depending on what area of dancing you're in. If you're in the commercial world versus the concert world or whatever the situation may be, accessibility changes. And it shifts because there's no governing body in dance. There is no governing law of accessibility from one dance space to the next. So depending on what it is in terms of what you're working on with your choreography, the accessibility is going to shift with every single space that you step into. And that's just something that you're going to have to be prepared for as a choreographer going in, because there may be a space where you have a little bit more control and you can easily make your vision come to life. Or you may be in a situation where you have less control and you don't have as much autonomy, which is not there and which is not what we're wanting, but is also the reality, and I want you to be aware of that. The last thing that I want to talk about is accessibility for employees in dance organizations. Here's the truth about accessibility with dance organizations. Most dance organizations do not have any type of accessibility accommodations. This is a very sad, very frustrating reality, but it is the reality nonetheless. And this is something that, if you noticed, is consistent across the board in most things in dancing. So something that I want to say again, know your rights. Know what your rights are going into these organizations where you know that there is not likely to be accessibility or accommodations available to you. Something that is crucial when you are working with an organization is making sure that you get things in writing. There is a lot of documentation that is involved in dance organizations, and a lot of that documentation is for the sake of like having archives or having some type of proof of something. And if you are in an organization, then you probably know what I'm talking about. Documentation is extremely important, especially in terms of like human resources and things like that. If you discuss accommodations with your dance organization, have it in writing in some way. And this is something that honestly can apply to everything. Conventions, competitions, studios, whatever it may be. One of the best things you can do is having your conversations in writing. Whether it's you writing down things, giving that to your employer, whatever it may be, having things in writing is extremely important, because if an issue of discrimination comes up, you can say, this is in writing, this is what we agreed to, etc. That is incredibly important in situations like that, and just incredibly important in general, because then it gives you something to stand on. Just in case. It's for your protection. It's to preserve your rights. Try to get as much in writing as you possibly can. Similar to that same note, reporting what is not working, dangerous things that happen, discrimination, all of that. Now, I say that with the full understanding that reporting these types of behaviors is not common within the dance community for the sake of backlash, consequences, being fired, whatever it may be. And also, not reporting these things is not going to change it. And as disabled people, we are at such a disadvantage in terms of being taken care of and being protected, that not speaking up when these things happen is only making that worse for us. But it's also extremely hard because we're already in a position to fail in a lot of ways. And it is very possible that us reporting these things, speaking out about these things, could be the reason why we lose our job or lose credibility or whatever ends up happening. It's very possible. And those are the things that have to change. Because reporting when something is wrong, when there's discrimination, when there's something harmful, should not come back on the person that's reporting it. It should just be open and received, and conversations of what the next steps are to figure this out and to fix this is really what should be happening in those situations. But I fully acknowledge that that is not the world we are currently living in. But if you feel comfortable to do so, to speak up about something that is not working for you or something that happens, discrimination, whatever it may be, do it. And my final thing to mention, like I mentioned with everything else, emergency preparedness safety protocols. A lot of times with dance organizations, the buildings that they are in can be very outdated and not equipped with a lot of accessibility. Now I say that to also say that accessibility is not just adding a wheelchair ramp. Accessibility goes much further than that. But in a lot of experiences that I've had, not all experiences, a lot of buildings are not accessible for a multitude of reasons. And with these buildings not being accessible, that makes emergency preparedness for any potential disabled employees incredibly dangerous. So, in terms of your organization, this is definitely something that you all should be having a conversation about. Another thing that I want to say to this point is that if you are a building that is currently going through renovation, and you're an organization that has received a grant for that, whatever it may be, please make sure that accessibility is included in your renovations. Please make sure that it is included and covered in grants. Make accessibility at the forefront, not the afterthought. There are a lot of times that I have seen dance organizations that are doing renovations to their building and all of these things, and accessibility is not included. And that's not okay. So, make sure that accessibility is a part of this part of your organization. And if it's not, this is when the conversations need to start happening, and there need to be things that need to be done in the future. But the best thing you can do is including accessibility from the get-go. So I hope that you all have enjoyed episode 8 of Is It Ableist? As always, I post every single Friday at 5 p.m. Central Standard Time and 6 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. And I will be back next week with a new video. I'm not going to say what the video is going to be yet, because it may be a surprise and a start to a series within a series. So just hold on tight until next week, and I will see you all back here for episode 9 of Is It Ableist? Bye.